So without further ado, I think Tania, Ramalho, you can start, and after that, after each one presents, we'll have time for debates among the presenters and comments and questions from the audience. How does that sound?
Can I start then?
Yes, you can, Tania.
In my presentation, which is online, and I have revised it, and since I have actually given a presentation in Portuguese to an Iberian group, and I have new things that I have to say, actually, that I have to incorporate. I pretty much started with my own experience when I was in graduate school many, many centuries ago. And I realized that I did not understand political perspectives until I read Alison Jagger's and Paula Rotenberg's book in a women's studies context. And it was all about feminist perspectives, political perspectives, but I was able to pretty much understand other non-feminists in contexts. And I had a revelation, and I could never read anything or see a program on television or watch the news without understanding what kind of perspectives. So I made the decision that as I started teaching in higher education, that my students probably did not understand those perspectives either. And that was pretty much my experience. And I started teaching them. I organized 3 perspectives, liberal and conservative, or conservative and liberal, which are pro-capitalist perspectives. And then because of the complexity of the critiques, I pretty much put everybody, including indigenous perspectives, everybody, starting with Marx, and I call them the critical perspective. So I discovered that there are pretty much 6 areas that you have to look in order to conceive of a political perspective, and that starts with the human nature. We go on to what constitutes the right or the accepted as legitimate sources of knowledge. What is the view of society? What's the view of economics? What is the view of the state and the government? And what is the view of social change, and who are the social change agents altogether? So these 6 characteristics gives us a pretty good perspective, and each perspective is pretty coherent. For instance, most of understanding of human nature in the conservative perspective comes from religious texts and also from biological studies that pretty much look for certainty that we are this way. And so it's a pretty flexible view of human nature. And from that, we go on, and each of the perspectives then complexify what are these perspectives. I go on to look at education. How do conservatives look at education? How liberals look at education? What critics will entertain about what education should be like? That is, this utopian view, not only of society, but also of the individual and the education of the individual for society. So that's what I do. And as I put 3 responses of my students, of the numerous responses I've had over the years, how groundbreaking it is, it organizes them. So I really believe that for global citizenship, but particularly for national, you can't divide national from global citizenship. People need to understand where the ideas are coming from and then clarify their own values. So that's where I stand. And I hope that everybody can do that, and that we can start integrating that since, elementary school pretty much. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tania. And if you haven't, everybody, if you haven't already seen Tania's video, I'll find the link to it, and or if anybody has a link to it, they can put it in the chat. That'd be much appreciated. I saw Pierre just came in. Okay, there we go. So I think I just want to respect the order that was given to me. Yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to ask Pierre Orelus if he can begin his resume, of his presentation.
Sure.
Pierre?
Happy to do so. Bonjour, Charmain. Ça va?
Bonjour. Bon matin.
Well, I would like to begin by thanking my dear friend Paul Carr and his partner who invited me to take part in this great symposium. I also want to thank Dre and Patrick who helped me with the video. I will try to synthesize what I talk about in the video, as well as I know how. I tend to speak a lot, but I'll do my best. I was invited to speak about the current state of democracy in Haiti, and the question that I asked and I aim to explore in this short presentation is the following: what does democracy mean within Haiti and the concept of Haiti? And if we have democracy in Haiti, whose interest does it serve, right? And I don't believe we can talk about democracy in Haiti in the context of Haiti without providing, a short overview or a short historical overview of Haiti, because Haiti is not Haiti, was not Haiti that we know of today, right? How did it come about? Haiti was colonized by France until the slaves decided to revolt in 1971 and led us to our independence in 1804. Now, when I talk about independence, what kind of independence are we referring to? Are we referring to political independence only, or is it both political and economic independence? Well, I would argue that Haiti hasn't really known any form of economic independence since 1804, because it's been victim of I would say of a coup d'etat, that took place in 1804 and continues taking place until now. Now, what do I mean by that? Haiti was not recognized by the United States until 1862, and France imposed a heavy debt on Haiti, right? From 1825 until 1947, Haiti had to pay a total amount of 90 billion francs. At the time, that's the currency that the French use now, use euro. So Haiti has been economically dependent on the West since its independence. It's not by accident, because they didn't want the slave to have any impact on the Western world, right? The slaves reach out to the US seeking support, right, to fight the French colonizers. Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time, refused to do so, refused to give us a hand, even though we participated in the independence of this country, right? He was afraid that the slave would have an impact on the blacks who are still seeking the freedom in this country as we're speaking, right? We've been murdered on the street, right? So now, going back to the theme that I was invited to speak about, democracy in Haiti. Can we talk about democracy in Haiti when we have a small group of Haitians made of mulattoes, historically who have been monopolizing the economy of the country? They've been the one, not only the mulattoes, also Daxing Haitians like myself, who somehow managed to move up and the economic as well as political ladder. They've been complicit in inviting, for example, foreigners to go to United States, to go to Haiti whenever we have an election, supposedly to observe what's happening. As we know, most of presidents that we have had in Haiti, except Jean-Bertrand Aristide and his former Prime Minister René Préval, who was elected, in 1990 and 2004 respectively. Most of the elections that we have had after that, they were manipulated by the United States, right? We have had 2 elections recently. One that led to Mr. Martelly, who was basically put in power by the US. Then he somehow managed to pave way for his, predecessor, whom we have actually, who's a puppet, who's a US puppet, who was not elected. He was also put in power. I'm referring to General Moise. So we haven't really had democracy since President Aristide was elected in 1990. When the masses went out and vote, he earned about 67% of the vote, if I'm not wrong. Then in 2004, when Pierre, his former president, was elected in 2004, and to some extent, we must say in 2004, the masses went out. But all the elections that occurred afterwards, they were sponsored by the Haitian bourgeois who have no interest in having a democratic state in Haiti. In fact, they've been anti-democratic movements in Haiti because those movements do not serve the interest, right? They are the ones who own the means of production. They are the ones who have factories. They are the ones who build houses to rent to, United Nations soldiers who went to Haiti and spread out cholera. And as we're speaking, those houses the bourgeois, the Haitian bourgeois, made mostly of mulatto, very tiny group, and also dark-skinned Haitians, I must add. They build those houses to make profits, right? As those foreigners or those neo-colonizers who are taking over the country, they have no interest in having any democratic state in Haiti because that would not serve their interests. If anything, they want to maintain a plutocracy that serves the economic and political interests. They are the one who've been behind coup d'etat in Haiti. They are the one who sponsor candidate senators, including middle-class Haitians who manage to move up the political ladder. They are the one who sponsor them. And then when they get elected, who makes the deal behind the scene? It's this tiny group of Haitian bourgeois and those core political leaders who have sold their soul to run for political, positions. Because if you don't have money in Haiti, you cannot run for anything. And who sponsor you? They're the ones who are anti-democratic movement. So it's really a very difficult time to talk about democracy in Haiti when people are being kidnapped. And those who are being kidnapping are not really necessarily poor Haitians. You see, kidnapping have been used as a political tool to destabilize the country. You see, so and the kidnappers now make no exception. They kidnap people equals the class line, gender line, right? You might be on the poor, walk on the street. If they suspect you may have some money, you become the target. So we cannot talk about democracy when the masses never had the opportunity to participate in this making process that affect their daily lives. They paid money to go on the street to kill opponents who may have anything to do with them. Does that make sense? So to me, there's no democracy except that a fabric form of democracy that the US have been trying to impose on us. That would be my conclusion. And I must conclude by saying what I talk about today, it's part of a book that I'm working on called Bleeding from Within, where I argue that before we had the colonizers and the island taking over, now we have a bunch of Haitians who have no political consciousness, who have made deals with foreigners, with neo-colonizers, and it really open doors to corporations to take over. We have the very few hotels we have in Haiti are owned not by Haitians, by Americans. So we cannot talk about democracy when there's when the distribution of resources, are unequal. When you have a tiny group of people who are living a luxurious life, and the majority are basically treated like scum of the earth. So democracy to me requires active participation of all people, including the masses who often, have been victimized by decisions made supposedly on their behalf but yet never really served the interest. So that's really what's happening in Haiti. As a guy who was born and grew up here, was forced to leave the island as a result of political turmoil, and I've been going there almost every year, and haven't seen much progress since the earthquake, when many money was poured on Haiti with hopes they would rebuild the country, but yet it's still struggling to recover, from the earthquake. And we have had multiple political and natural disasters that have impacted the country, and yet the people who receive the money supposed to have the country, put in their pockets. So we don't have democracy in Haiti. We hope to build one with the masses until the masses will get to the street like they did in 1990 and take their destiny in their own hands. We can't and shouldn't talk about democracy.
Thank you very much, Pierre. I'll give the microphone, the virtual microphone, to Bradley Porfilio. And I assume, Dr. Porfilio, you're in Buffalo.
Well, actually, I was in Buffalo recently. Paul, I was actually allowed to travel there. I visited some friends and family. I've not traveled in 14 months, but I'm back home in San Jose, and so I'm happy to be back. But this is just part of who I am. It's actually when I met Paul, Carr, and Gina several years ago, and I just want to say it's a pleasure seeing everyone. I wanted to thank all of the presenters and organizers of this conference. The only other thing, I just had one quick question. Is it possible later to show a video clip? Is that okay, Paul?
How long is it?
It's about 2 minutes.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Okay. So my particular presentation and part of my work for many years has focused on citizenship education. So this is a particular part of this particular session, and it's focused more specifically looking at the role of active citizenship in the context of our global world. And one particular, I would say, germane site that I've looked at through not only oral histories with youth in Canada, oral histories in the context of the United States, my own critical work in France, looking at various types of manifestations and ideas and identities, has focused on global hip hop culture. And this is the context of my presentation. So in my particular presentation, I look at the history of hip hop culture in the United States, where it was born, how it became about, and some of the same conditions where hip hop is often still part of the everyday fabric of schools and society and of youth, took place in the United States in the mid 1970s. And in particular, African youth, Latinx youth, and youth from the dominant culture dealt with some of the same conditions today that they're struggling with across the globe, whether it's homelessness, joblessness, over-policing of their communities, segregated schools, just a really inherent youth-hating culture, as many people would frame it in the context of the 1970s. This particular culture continued to resonate not only in the context of the United States, it continued to move across borders. And the way it moved really depended upon local conditions and other global forces. Some of the global forces that impacted the development of youth culture, of hip hop culture, focused on mass media in particular. I'll just give you a couple examples to show this. So for instance, in France, there wasn't hip hop culture that was part of the fabric of France in the 1970s, when hip hop started to take place in urban cultures in the United States, particularly the Bronx, New York, and in particularly Los Angeles. But due to the migration of people from Africa, due to the migration of people from Latin America, and due to the migration of hip hop artists coming to France in the mid 1980s, you started to gravitate towards that particular culture. But the manifestations of hip hop was different, really were different compared to the United States. During the mid 1980s, the hip hop intellectuals in France only gravitated to one element of hip hop, and that was graffiti in particular. In the United States, there's several elements of hip hop, if you know, in particular breakdancing, graffiti, critical consciousness. Those are just some that come to mind. MCing, of course, rapping, those are those particular junctures. And I move on, and when I look at global hip hop, I've been focusing more recently on indigenous youth and in Canada. And hip hop culture took place there very differently as well. It really only happened into the mid 1990s. And that was more for, again, with the influx of technology, many indigenous youth moving from reservations to urban contexts, they started to become affected in positive ways with hip hop culture. In particular, one artist, and there's a documentary that I just produced, that's why I wanted to show a clip of it. It's called We're Still Here. It's been placed upon PBS stations across the United States. I was in Vancouver, British Columbia last year, prior to the pandemic. I was in Fort Nelson, also in the context of Northern Canada with Indigenous youth. And why it started to resonate and how it started to resonate with youth, as one particular artist said, Oz 12 from this particular documentary, he's one of the pioneers of hip hop in Canada, was because hip hop made them and gave them a voice that they never had. It made something out of nothing. That's what he said. So youth getting collectively involved, they're engaged in collective activities, they're vocalizing their frustrations and their alienations because they struggle with many types of different social conditions that were causing problems in their communities. Anything from domestic violence, murder and missing Indigenous women, foster care. They talk about the 60 scoops, for instance. They talk about that particular phenomenon. They talk about the residential phenomenon. They talk about poverty. But the other thing that they focus on is settler colonialism, having this critical awareness that settler colonialism is responsible for their oppression in their context. And more recently, you find Indigenous youth interacting with other youth. So for instance, the Indigenous movement last year in the context with Idle No More and the youth across the globe, Greta Thunberg in particular, they focus collectively in getting involved in rallies and protests to struggle against the fact that the Canadian government, large-scale corporations continue to plunder their land, take over territories, and take over their resources. So the argument that I make in this particular paper, and I've continued to make it, hip hop does different things when you look at active citizenship. It looks at this idea of revolutionary practice, having a critical understanding of the world, reflecting with others, and acting collectively to transform schools and society and create and eliminate settler colonialism, to build a democratic society based upon different principles. Democracy, justice, truth, some of those things, solidarity, those are the principles that hip hop and global hip hop culture tends to be there. This particular element of hip hop culture. The other thing that it does, if you look at hip hop culture, it brings a new, I would say, generative portrait of youth. Instead of many people framing youth as up to no good, as being aberrant, as being drug users, etc., it provides an enlightened portrait of youth and looking at them as active citizens instead of objects. That's a particular juncture that we look at hip hop culture. The other thing that it does in terms of active citizenship, it really shows the fact that there is this global dissent movement. It's not just this micro movement. People are struggling collectively to struggle against settler colonialism. And I just wanted to also say that part of the presentation would have focused in, a little bit more time. It would have said that hip hop has many iterations. I mean, this is not the dominant form of hip hop culture, this active citizenship, this emancipatory type of culture. Large scale corporations have hijacked hip hop for its own game. Many times they put in negative portraits. They portray hip hop as it being about hustlers in the gang, about drug use, about violence, glorifying violence. That's just one element. So you have to dig deeper. You have to look at these elements. You have to look at the lyrics. You have to look at the activist activities. You have to connect with youth. Many of these youth are going into schools and connecting with communities, and they're going beyond the borders of their own communities. As I said, they're going through social media as a way, just like we're doing today, to really vocalize their displeasure with society and acting creatively to struggle to create a better world. So can I show just one particular quick clip for a couple minutes? And it's from Fort Nelson, Canada, and it's in particular about a tour that 3 different hip hop intellectuals had, and they focused on Indigenous youth, and it talks about the music and the different messages that they connect with youth and really transform their lives in many productive ways, I would say. So if I can show that, that would be great just for a second.
All right. Are you able to show it or?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Let me see if we can share it. I will go down. We'll go here. You'll get there in 1 second. show it.
Miles from Vancouver in far northern British Columbia. Hip-hop and trauma healing are seen as a new vital part of First Nation educational experience.
Sorry, Brad, we can't see the video.
A few miles outside of the town, at Shallow School, created and funded by local First Nation tribal members. Tribal heritage and traditions form the backbone of a place-based, student-centered education curriculum.
We started the school from a trailer. And the reason that we started our own school because there was discrimination in the schools. Our kids weren't going to school. They do relate more to this school. I mean, the physical presence is close to home. I mean, it's has their family members on the walls so that they could see, who their ancestors were. And yeah, and people could come and visit, elders would come and visit the school.
I'm sorry, Brad, we can't see the video right now.
Let's keep that show going, DJ.
Well, I'm sorry about that.
You just need to reshare your screen and show when the video is open, so you can share the video directly.
Let me go to the screen, share my video.
Oui, ça marche.
That's okay. I mean, for some reason it's not going. I'm not sure what happened. But anyway, the whole context of the video continues with the hip hop artist. They're connecting with youth and many of the other things that I would say is culturally relevant. It's active citizenship education. Many of the same struggles that the youth who come to these particular schools, Joey Styles, Mike Scott in particular, the artist, are dealing with the same struggles that the youth are grappling with. Some of the youth are dealing with drug abuse. Some of them are dealing with suicide in their communities. Some of them are dealing with bullying in schools. Some of them are dealing with being put in foster care from the dominant society, white foster care systems. Some of them are dealing with the fact that their lands are being taken away from them. Some are feeling alienated by being on reservations, dealing with the effects of settler colonialism. And in many ways that they've connected with these youth, and in particular, the youth are getting involved in collective conversations. They're utilizing the same music that youth consume and produce. I can tell you that's why it's culturally relevant. Many of them have become role models for these youth. They look up to them. Many of these kids have actually formed their own organizations to fight off, violence. They've stood up against, murder and missing Indigenous women. And the other thing that I can say that they work hand in hand with these youth. Some of them have produced their own videos and documentaries, and have written their own songs, and they've been involved in activist activities. So that's what I'm looking at, active citizenship, global citizenship through the activist activities and the cultural manifestations of hip hop culture, global hip hop culture. But as I said, these are not the dominant forms of manifestations, but they need to be used as an educative tool in the context of K through 12 schools, university settings. And I've been using this work quite a bit for the past 15 years. So I wanted to say thanks so much for allowing me to present today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bradley. I'll just send out a few questions to the three presenters, and we'll do a round, but I think we'll do a round in the opposite direction. And then after that, if we still have time, we'll open up to questions and comments from the audience. First of all, Tania, I mean, I totally agree with your epistemology in terms of democratic education, and I just would like to know, how do you see, can you give examples of dismantling undemocratic ideals through education and what that looks like? Bradley already gave an example of hip hop. Can you give other examples? I'll put out all my questions, and then we can answer, and I'll in the inverse order. Pierre, I found your presentation fascinating, and I had the privilege of visiting Haiti a few years ago, and I really want to go back one day. But could you give us examples of social organization that are taking place in Haiti today? I'm more familiar with the feminist movement, but I know there are others. And also, what is the role? How do you see the role of the international community? Because you and a lot of others have demonstrated the nefarious role of international cooperation in Haiti. But in terms of what would you like to see what the role of international cooperation in Haiti in terms of contributing to democracy and contributing to empowerment, to grassroots empowerment. And for Bradley, you mentioned some of the in terms of indigenous communities and hip hop. But from what I understand, the voices in hip hop are very masculine. And I know there are some feminine voices in hip hop, but can you talk about how the role of women in hip hop, in indigenous cultures, in indigenous communities, or in others? So we'll start with Bradley, and then we'll work our way back to Tania.
Great. No, thanks so much for connecting. And I would say the terms of, hip hop being a male-centered cultural movement, in many cases that still is the dominant role. There have been female hip hop artists in the indigenous communities that I focused on in this documentary and others. So for instance, JB, the First Lady, is connected. She speaks out about settler colonialism. She's been a big vocal part of the whole context of murder and missing indigenous women. One particular one that I connected with, a female artist, was Tania, and she really tried to break down the stereotypical trope of hip hop being a male-centered domain. She actually utilized a shirt, and she had this that her particular audience members would use. She was from Canada as well, Northern Canada. And it said, my favorite hip hop artist wears a skirt. So that was a way for them to break down into this male-centered field. That's even the same particular space that when you look at dancing or b-boying, I've connected with hip hop artists in the United States, and we produced a co-edited volume in particular. And now they are actually professors in psychology, and there were B girls. So there are B girls who are collectively involved in the movement. And it's really about people who have to be in that space to recognize that it's been male-centered, to bring in a positive voices from female artists and activists and work collectively for fundamental change. And I've seen that in particular with Dakota Bear. I would give you just another example. When I was doing the documentary in Vancouver, he invited female artists into that space, and he connected with them, and they worked collectively together. And it was actually JB, the First Lady, one of the pioneers of hip hop in Canada, indigenous hip hop, that brought Dakota Bear into the scene, because she realized he was committed to fundamental social change. He was committed to eliminating patriarchy, and he created kind of this collective movement. But I think that's one thing that has to be broken down, is just to think that hip hop is always associated with rap. And I think that's continually out there, but to show alternative visions of that, whether that hip hop is involved in graffiti, breakdancing, that particular way. And I think that's where you bring a more holistic understanding of hip hop. And the last thing I can give you, and just you brought back another thought. I was connected with a youth-led organization in Canada called the 411 Initiative for Change. And a lot of the youth that they were connected with, when they did a tour across Canada, they were connecting with over 100,000 Canadian youth. And they asked what was missing from the presentations and performances of the hip hop artists. And many of the girls said the girls' voices were excluded. So they actually did a tour that focused on girls' rights and girls' issues. So you have to be cognizant of it, and you have to bring about a collective solidarity to ensure that patriarchy does not continue to create a movement that just dominates the voices of men and boys. So that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me briefly respond to your first question. Like you, Charmain, if I pronounce your name correctly, I'm mostly familiar with the feminist movement because I was interested in knowing what they were doing on the ground. But recently, I've been in touch with some colleagues of mine, well, former classmates and friends who have decided to have some youth organizations. And I've been contributing to one of them every year. It's called Haiti Vision, and is led by a sociologist by the name of Michel Jacques, who's happened to be, a friend of mine, whom I trust. So there are people who are doing, their small part, in order to, to contribute to Haiti's progress. But there are many political organizations. I don't refer to those. We don't know who's behind them, who's paying them. I don't refer to those. But I'm mostly in touch with, colleagues, professors, and students who have, student organizations that I try to be involved in those organizations. I try to stay away from political organizations. So I cannot talk about any political, movements per se, because I'm not involved with them. But there are grassroots movements like the one led by my friend Michel, who decided to organize, football tournament. Well, we say soccer tournament every year. Tournament, right? Every year, where instead of allowing the kids to go on the street, doing nothing, sometimes, he has created ways in which for them to come and play soccer and always with a theme, unity, fighting diversity, fighting unity among diversity. It's trying to bring peace, to teach them about dialogue, tolerance, peace, and then how to think of themselves, how to avoid, conflict on the street, how to avoid, being part of gangs. And I think that's what I want to be involved in. I don't want to be part of any political organization. So that's what I'm aware of. Obviously there might be a lot more happening. Now, you ask how people from the West or from outside Haiti can come, and help. One thing I would advise them to do is not to, reach out to the bourgeois, those who basically have no interest in changing the status quo. Often foreigners who don't know about the concept of Haiti, when they go there, they go to the educated ones. Most of them are corrupt. They are middle class Haitians who may have been may have grown up in the ghetto, may have been may have been born in to poor family, and somehow managed to go to school and become middle class. They tend to be the most dangerous class in Haiti, as I based on my observation, and I'm happen to be one of them. I may not be I may not be pursuing what they're pursuing in Haiti, trying to, cutting deals with NGOs who go there supposedly to help. There are NGOs, that go there with the good intention to help Haitians, but the middle class Haitians who work with them don't even want to deal with the farmers. They don't want to really mingle with the poor. So they become like a very, bourgeois kind of middle class. They talk about the poor from their offices, comfortable offices, right? They don't go to mingle with the poor. They build, shanty houses for them, but they pocket the money. The chunk of the money goes into the pocket. So if people are serious about, helping Haiti, they will first need to know what's happened. They go to Haiti, mingle with the people, get to know the context. Don't let those core bourgeois middle class Haitians too, who many of whom speak English. They are the one who get to speak with the foreigners who might only speak English, who may not speak Creole. So if a foreigner want to help Haiti, first try to learn the language, or go with an interpreter who really has a political consciousness, who really knows what's going on, who really can actually get you in touch with the people who are in need. Sometimes the money doesn't go to those who are in need. They go to people like myself. I mean, I can make money of Haiti if I want to. I'm ashamed to say that. There are many Haitians who do that, right? But by saying so, I'm not saying all Haitians who are trying to help Haiti down there, are corrupt. There are Haitians like myself who are genuinely, interested in contributing to Haiti. But unfortunately, they don't get to even be in touch with those foreigners. They don't really, they don't. We have missionaries, American missionaries go there supposedly go to Haiti, but who do they hang out with? They hang out with Haitian middle class who speak English, who can be their interpreter. And those Haitian middle class often they don't want those the poor to get close to those white missionaries, you know, because they feel shame. The poor mind pass them in front of the white missionaries. When in fact, supposedly, those white missionaries are there to meet with the poor, to push them the gospel, a gospel of misery, a gospel that tells them, you know, pray, 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 Lord's gonna save you. In the meantime, the poor are being poor and every day. Those white missionaries, they go there, they live in luxurious hotel, they get paid by the US government, and only to tell the poor to accept the horrible economic conditions. I think those Haitian middle class should really reconsider how they engage those white missionaries. There should be interpreters. I have no problem interpreting for a white missionary, but I need to know what goals you have in mind. Why are you here? Are you here to preach me about accepting Jesus Christ as my savior when I can't even feed my kids? So those Haitians are complicit in the misery of all poor Haitians. And what I'm saying is, if foreigners really are serious about helping Haiti, we want to accept help with dignity. You want to know about Haiti? Get to know the poor, not the middle class, who have no interest, for the most part, in transforming the status quo from which they have benefited from decades. And I think that must be denounced, you know, publicly. And I'm so grateful for having the opportunity to denounce poor, you know, the middle class Haitians who have used Haiti misery to enrich themselves. You know, they speak on the name of the poor, but they don't want the poor to even get close to those foreigners who may have good intention to go to Haiti to help. But those corrupt middle class Haitians, you know, and complicity with the bourgeois, the very tiny group of bourgeois made of mulattoes, I must put out, as well as taxing Haitians, they have no interest really in helping the poor, for whom many foreigners go to Haiti every year.
Thank you very much, Pierre. And we can come back to that later if we have time. Tania? Have to unmute.
Would you repeat your question again? You are
Now I am. Now I am.
muted,
Okay,
yes.
now I'm good. All right. Could you give examples, other examples of dismantling undemocratic ideals in education? How that's taking place today in the U.S.?
Very frankly, I do not know what's taking place. I know what's taking place in higher education, and that, as far as I know, most programs in teacher education are what they call social justice oriented. My school in particular has been social justice oriented, and in the past 20 years, a supporter of critical pedagogy and critical literacy in education, so that we try to do our best. But very truthfully, what happens when our students go into public school teaching, they, you know, they want a job, they want a life, and they have to pretty much follow whatever the dictates of their districts are, and they become conservatized. And these conservative ideas about education are very, very robust. And there are many economic interests vested in them. And there's also symbolic interests in terms of competition between both administrators and teachers and districts, schools. And so that whole culture of competition does not get to be overcome. So what Paul was talking earlier about solidarity, which one way, we still have unions, though the unions have really been emptied in this country, all unions, and teachers' unions still standing strong to the horrible attacks. But solidarity has been eroded in terms of for teachers who are unionized in many different ways. So that it's very, in my view, very tragic state. But in higher education, we continue to, not just my school, but many schools around the country. And some, we continue trying to work into schools, but it's very difficult. So I don't know what Bradley has to say about that, because he works in California context where critical pedagogy was a little more advanced and had a little better reception than northern white New York State. So
Okay, thank you very much to all three of you. Do we still have time for questions from the audience?
We still have time, but
Good,
there has
great.
been no questions asked.
I
Okay.
have questions.
Okay, well, I see Paul's hand, but I'm going to start with Tania and then Paul.
Okay.
And I don't see any other hands.
My question is for Professor Orelus about Haiti. You know, it's an extraordinary, complex situation in Haiti, but they standing next to Cuba. And I was wondering what's the relationship, despite of the pressure of the US. Are there any attempts to connect with an island that has managed to liberate to a certain extent themselves? With what's the relationship between Haiti groups and Cuba?
Well, historically, Haiti and Cuba have had a good relationship, particularly when Castro was in power. I don't know about now. I do not believe Haiti, and I can speak from what I've been told on the ground, because when I go there, I speak with the people on the ground, and I have colleagues, you know, people who are now professors that I went to school with. Some of them are senators, and I have one of my cousins who was senator, very controversial figure. I mean, he's a cousin, he's still a cousin. So I get information from him, and which I cannot reveal. But right now, Haiti doesn't have the best relationship with Cuba, because the current president is in line with U.S. government policy. You know, in fact, they were forced. Well, Haiti was forced to go against Venezuela recently, not too long ago. So we don't have the best relationship with Cuba. However, historically, we have had a very good relationship with Cuba. In fact, Cuba is one of the countries that has sent doctors to Haiti to help us, right? During the cholera. And there are Cuban doctors who are still in Haiti. They decided to leave after the pandemic. And we have actually a Cuban community in Haiti. Cubans who decided to live in Haiti. And I had the privilege to, not to talk to them per se, but to walk through and observe where they are, the place. But my goal is really to find out what it is they are doing there. It's like a little Cuban, Cuban, Haitian, decided to go to Haiti, return to Haiti, and then they have like a little Cuban community somewhere in Del Mar, right? And I would say in a nutshell, we have had a good relationship with Cuba. Haitians go to Cuba to actually study medicine and return to Haiti to become doctors. And I've had the privilege to actually benefit from one of them. When my daughter was ill, I was in Haiti for a sabbatical from 2014, 2015. My daughter was not feeling well, and I said, okay, let's see what kind of service they provided. So I went there, which first tried to go there to see if the service was good, and it was decent. So I would say good historically.
Thank you, Pierre. Paul, your question?
Okay, yeah, many thanks, Charmain. Thank you, Pierre, Brad, Tania. Wonderful to see you and hear you. And I'm wondering, you're all in the United States, you're academics in American universities, and you're also looking at issues that deal with marginalized groups, social class, upheaval, and so on. What do you see as kind of signs of hope within the American academy? The United States is such a complex society, so much creativity, so much innovation, and at the same time, it's an empire. And I'm wondering the social class consciousness, because some of the issues you're dealing with, it seems that it's difficult to develop consciousness across classes. And how do you see this in the United States now in relation to social solidarity in order to develop a democracy that's more vibrant and robust and responsive to the needs of people?
Want me to start, Paul? Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Brad.
Okay, will give you maybe some bad news with this and then maybe give you some good. Because as you know, I always think about educational institutions being set up to promote the dominant interest in society, whether they're higher education, whether they're K through 12 schools. So if we just look at in terms of the pandemic, you see an erosion of the liberal arts and sciences across the United States. So the pandemic has been a front for those who control wealth and power for the most part to say that there's an economic crisis, kind of this whole idea of the shock doctrine. We can go back to Naomi Klein to say that, okay, because of this, what needs to be cut first would have to be the humanities, would have to be philosophy departments, would have to be world languages. Paul, it's a continuation of that. The other thing that's been going hand in hand with that, you see, is that the resources that have been funded to the more conservative disciplines, whether STEM, whether the so-called hard sciences. Then the third thing that goes hand in hand, there's an uncontrollable management system in higher education in the United States. We've been hiring more and more managers in the context of the academic institutions, but eliminating the need for full-time professors and faculty. And they're continually supporting a higher proportion of administrators. Good things that I've seen, though, in the context of California, I'll just give you a couple. There has been a commitment to anti-racist, pedagogy and solidarity. I see that in the context of our union. I can see that in terms of the last hires that we had here, that there's a racial justice component that we've been continually asked to look at as faculty members to ensure that anti-racism permeates the context of our teaching and learning in the College of Education, that the new hires should be committed to anti-racist education and eliminating of racism in society, and the research should focus in this particular way as well. I also see just kind of the connected outside of schools. You see more teacher education programs preparing people to promote ethnic studies in the context of schools in California as well. Now, again, California is not the same as some of the other particular institutions across the United States. I know Georgia's not doing that. I know some of the states in the deep South, but that's kind of where I see some of the seed beds of hope. But on those three types of things that I mentioned earlier, trends, the influx of administrators, the gutting of the liberal arts and sciences I see, and just this whole context of the elimination or the lack of the need for tenure track faculty is creating in some ways many obstacles to promoting an anti-racist education, or as you said, also an education that's about solidarity in the academy and outside the academy. And that's how I would respond to your question, Paul. Thanks so much for asking.
How are we on time?
We still have about 5 minutes.
Fantastic. Good. Are there any other questions from the audience or comments? Or among our speakers?
Well,
Yeah.
I think Bradley did a very nice job covering everything. I don't really have much to say, Bradley. You basically provided a very, sad and at the same time hopeful picture of the situation. I cannot speak from what I've been able to observe, experience. I cannot speak generally about the US. You cannot. I mean, of course, you read, you try to, stay in touch with the literature. But what I can really speak from is from my personal experiences. As a former administrator, I was born, and where I'm not right now, I was born as department chair. And before I was at New Mexico State University, where I led 2 programs combined, bilingual and TESOL program. And then as I was trying to relocate, my family, myself, and I ended up applying for a position here, for a chair position. Well, I was happy to come in as chair. And of course, and a predominantly white institution, they always find ways to make you feel comfortable when you are one of the top, that's what I was told, one of the top, candidates. So I accepted the offer, and then I came in. The first 3 months were okay. And after that, you started seeing things that you never thought you would experience. As an administrator, as faculty, I never knew how the system works from the inside per se. So that's when I see, a good disparity in whether it's gender-based, race-based. I was the first Black, chair. I was there were only 2 people of color. I mean, talk about the school that's been exist for almost 50 years. And I was the first Black and non-US born. It's all those first really annoy me. I don't take pleasure in talking about it. In fact, I feel it's upsetting. In the 21st century, they would have only the first Black. And maybe I was not as threatened as maybe an African American would have been to them. Maybe they felt comfortable bringing me in as a foreigner, as a non-US born. So many things that I try to understand: accentism, racism, classism, and sexism, how they intersect. And I've seen all of it. How the woman, how the male faculty, were treated, how they expected me to treat them, compared to the female faculty. I mean, just the dynamics. You felt comfortable talking, about sexism, with maybe because I'm a man, they thought I would support them with the sexist behavior, and there's so many things I never thought I would experience as an administrator. And then you were forced to cut down on positions that were not considered important, as Bradley said. You were forced to let people go that you really wanted to keep because they're good people, but they were not serving the system. So you were used to make decisions that your heart, your soul know that were wrong, but it's either you make the decisions or you out, right? But this is why I decided to step down. I said, I can no longer participate in massive injustice. Massive injustice. People are like part-timers. You let them go. You use them as just as disposable. And I would never know. I would not have known that had I not been department chair. You see, and you see how personally, I was experiencing microaggression every day. And people felt threatened about my being their boss. Who are you to be my boss? I mean, you are the boss, but they wanted to make you feel like you are the subaltern due to your racial and linguistic identities. I'm a Black man who speaks a different accent. So all these intersections play their role in the way they perceive you, the way you perceive them. By the way, at the end of the day, when you go to a place, you're trying to figure out the place, but the place figures you out as well. But by the place, I'm referring to the people who make the place. So to me, we are not in the best position. There's been a pushback against critical race theory. Even our president is dangerous to talk about race in schools. But on the contrary, but in the meantime, he's trying to impose the Bible on us. We have to have Bible studies in our classes, right? So to me, we are experiencing a neoliberal, era in the United States with the current president. He's no different. It's not different. It's a friendlier discourse. But at the end of the day, the poor are getting poor. With the middle class are getting hit every day, man. I mean, we are just right on the edge to becoming poor. At any point we can become poor. So it's a very fragile state we are living in right now.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Tania, would you like to have the last word?
Yeah, very, very brief. I was thinking as I heard, Pierre, that what Paul was talking about this morning, the paradoxes, we are feeding the paradoxes. I think that's the best we can do.
Thank you. And our wonderful moderator, Laurent, he has added the link to the happy hour, and he has also added what he calls our 2 Framapads, which maybe you can explain that, for comments and suggestions, and the links are there as well. And there is also a survey in order to evaluate the symposium, but I assume that you want people to evaluate it on Friday when they've been able to absorb as much of the symposium as possible. With that said, I'd like to thank our organizers, Paul, Gina, their whole team, because I know behind them there's an incredible team. Laurent, once again, thank you very much for everything. I don't think I could have done this without you. Our 3 speakers, which really enriched the discussions about education, about democratization. I'd like to thank all 3 of them, Tania, Ramalho, Pierre, Orelus, and Bradley Porfilio. Thank you so much, the 3 of you, and I hope that we will be able to continue the conversation this afternoon and throughout the symposium. Thank you very much to all, and have a wonderful afternoon.